We're back with Volker Hirsch, partner from Amadeus Capital. I know Volker for many years when he was executive at BlackBerry. He's a serial entrepreneur as well, and digital gaming and business angel. So he's very active, helping other people using technology and finding new solutions. So it has a wealth of experience, and we are lucky to have him today.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. I'll speak today about future of work. Maybe perhaps first 2 lines on myself. As Amadeus said, I've been an entrepreneur and I'm now a partner at Amadeus Capital. For those who don't know, Amadeus, we are a UK-based VC. And according to PitchBook, we're Europe's most active AI investor. So a lot of the things that you've seen in the movie, we actually invest in. We're doing deep, hardcore tech here. There's an overview of what I'm going to talk to you about today. Of course, I'm only kidding, because I'm not actually an AI engineer. So I, in the contrary, will actually start at the extreme other end, and that is data, because data is technically photographs, is at the very heart of this. And because I'm not an engineer, I asked myself, data, and how much of that do we have? And as we're doing this today, I went onto the internet and I thought, okay, so how much data is that? Out that it's a lot. In 2020, the global IP traffic consisted of around 2,500 exabytes, and that's a 2.5x increase in over the last 5 years only. So I hope you're duly impressed by this very large number. Because what I actually asked myself is, what on earth is an exabyte? Would you know that? Now, an exabyte is a very large number. It's 10 to the power of 18. And most of us still can't really picture this. Therefore, I put a picture of the Library of Congress behind you, behind the number. The Library of Congress is the largest library in the world. And you can fit the entire text content of every single book in this library on an exabyte, 100,000 times. So last year, basically, we transacted information over the internet in the equivalent of 250 million times the largest library in the world. Thank God we have Google, I guess, right? Now, that is, of course, not where it stops. First of all, data that we exchange over the internet is only a fraction of the data that we have overall. IDC suggests that by 2025, we will actually have data on this planet of 180 zettabytes, and that's 180,000 exabytes. Now, that is what we have available. Again, because we cannot really picture this, what that means, I brought you a dinosaur, and one with a very, very cool name. And thanks to my great skills, this dinosaur actually had a MacBook at its finger, or rather tail tips. So this amount of data, if the dinosaur would have pressed download just before it got extinct 65 million years ago, then round about today, present day internet speeds, this download would complete. That is how much we're talking about. And just to give you one example on where things can go from here, I live in the leafy countryside in Cheshire, in northwest England, and very close to us is this telescope here. This is Jodrell Bank, and if you're an astronomer, then this is one of your cathedrals, because it used to be the largest telescope in the world. Now, Jodrell Bank today is home to the headquarters of the Square Kilometre Array, the SKA in short, which is overseen by the University of Manchester. And what they're building at the moment is 2 kilometer square of telescopes, one in South Africa and the other one in Northwest Australia. And once they switch these on, which I think will happen very soon, then the data output of this planet will increase by a factor of 2. So the SKA alone will output more data because it's such a sharp telescope, it will see things that we've never seen before. It's 50 times more accurate than the Hubble telescope. So that it will basically collect data in the equivalent of 2 times the entire internet. What we do have today is we have all this knowledge in our pocket. So the question, of course, is knowledge still power? And this to us humans is really important because, in school, our teachers and at home, our parents always told us, you got to learn something because then we'll be able to find great jobs and go from there. On top of that, we're also seeing new data sources, and we're seeing them in the real world, and sometimes even in the weirdest places, in tiny little towns in Arkansas, for instance. Iola, that is how you pronounce it, is home to a company called Big River Steel, and that's a good old-fashioned steel factory. When you go to their website, this is what you see. They basically have reinvented themselves as a technology company that happens to make steel. They partnered with a company called Noodle AI to effectively rethink their entire supply chain, pop sensors into that thing that helps them to raise productivity and just produce better steel faster and at lower cost. When we're speaking of data sources, also have to think of cities, because cities effectively are mountains of sensors. There are sensors everywhere. I'm not a city planner, but even when I sit down for only 5 minutes and think what there is, then this is an incomplete list of things there are. Everything from air quality, bloody traffic lights. You basically record that data. When is the train running? How many taxis are there? Gas flows, you name it. All those are data points that we have. If you drive a modern day car, it might have LiDAR, and this is basically how LiDAR watches the world. 2.2 million data points every single second. So what we're seeing today is not only, the old Moore's law of computing, but we're just seeing exponential growth in both data capture and data sources. And each of those amplify each other and basically create a flywheel that is very, very hard to fathom. And that brings me to Industry 4.0, as it's known, and in this respect, to think of the robots that you're seeing in a moment, not as things with red shiny eyes, but as a data node. Now, if you're not familiar with that term node, this is the reason why this is important. This is Metcalfe's law, and there's a reason why there's phones behind it. I'll explain this in a second. So the law basically says that the value of a network is the square of its nodes. And he illustrated this like that. The reason why he used telephones is because Metcalfe basically tried to convince the ITU at the time that we should have a standard for Ethernet ports because the network would become so much more valuable if basically everything can communicate with each other. But let's go back to industry. So this is how it started. This was in itself a very revolutionary factory, this river gouge factory where the Model T was built. And as you can see, very few robots, very many humans. This is Tesla's old factory. This is like where the Model S is being produced. And you can already many robots, not many humans. When you look at where this is an Amazon warehouse. And the little orange things that you see are robots. The company was called Kiva Systems. Amazon acquired them a while ago. And the last number I could find was from 2019, where they had over 200,000 of these things deployed. Now, what they do is they basically shuttle the shelves with products on them towards the poor human that then needs to pack it into a box. Now, what that means, however, to Amazon's business is that order fulfillment became 4 times faster. And in an industry like warehouse logistics, which is fairly mature, and those margins are just out of this world and pretty insane. If you're at home, you might have a robot at home. This is the Roomba robotic cleaner. If you study at George Mason in Virginia, then this is how your pizza would be delivered. And I'm serious; these things are deployed in the wild. In Finland, they put this autonomous bus into public normal service last year, the year before. That pays well, etc. Law was right up there. Now, there are a bazillion pieces of bots, in this case robots without bodies, that that are helping lawyers to do their work better, but at the same time also potentially replacing people who are doing this, because when you, for instance, practice corporate law, in particular as a junior lawyer, you will spend a ton of time in a so-called data room, where in M&A transactions, the company's documents are being held for inspection. Now, as the name suggests, a data room consists effectively of data, and we have AI that can actually do this job quite well. This is a bot with a body, and that other safe job was doctors and surgeons, etc. It might not be so safe anymore. The short of it is that automation will take the jobs that it can take. The graph you see here, it was the percentage of population of Americans working in agriculture, and it has come down to almost nothing, and it goes further. So if anyone talks to you about immigrants, it's automation. These are grape harvesting robots. You see them in France during grape harvesting season on pretty much every field. It's already here. For ourselves, it's interesting to think of those things and our job, whether or not they're above or below the API. In theory, everything that is repeatable and standardizable arguably falls below the API because it could be automated. Everything that isn't standardizable and easily repeatable, you're probably safe. But why did I delve into all this? So let's take a step back and look why this matters. When I spoke of the amounts of data that we create, and then told you about the additional new data sources that we're creating, which create more data, then it means we're basically pouring it all into these massive data lakes. Some of that data is structured, some is unstructured. AI generally finds it easier to deal with structured data, but increasingly there are tools that can actually handle and pick up and classify unstructured data sets as well. So all these sensors that we've been speaking about, they mean that things are no longer just connected, but they're increasingly interconnected and with each other. This, you saw that LiDAR map earlier. This here is a 3D point map, which was probably shot with some drone. But what the startup behind this did, they're called Sansa, based out of London, they effectively turned this into a canvas for structural engineers and engineering firms when they want to build more like this. You can basically use simple computations in it to figure out how many lorries do you need to send to the construction site in order to move earth, or how long the steel girder be for that bridge that you're building. And that brings me to that last step, and that is where we go from Industry 4.0 to 5.0, because all those large data sets can really only meaningfully be processed by artificial intelligence. Here we go. Now, on the right, incidentally, this is how AI looks. This is a graph produced by a portfolio company of ours called GraphCo. What you're looking at is the graph of a BERT training model. It's one of the approaches in transformer models, and it's very much on the rise. So if you wanted to visualize that, this is how an AI thinks. Now, at the very start, you might remember it was Garry Kasparov's play against AI. Now, IBM Deep Blue effectively was a very large cluster of computers in the next room that had learned everything, every chess move ever made. So they basically brute force computed against Garry Kasparov. Jump forward to 2011, IBM's Watson famously beat everyone else in a game of Jeopardy. From a computational Jeopardy is a little harder because, as you may know, is they basically give you an answer and then the task is to formulate the question, which isn't as straightforward as figuring out best moves and remembering those. Then we hit 2016, and DeepMind, now owned by Google, announced that that they had developed AlphaGo and that they would now play against Lee Sedol. And if you don't know Lee Sedol, I did not know him. Lee Sedol is basically the Rafa Nadal, Djokovic, and Roger Federer of Go all rolled into one and had not lost a single Go in over 20 years. So he is basically the best who's ever played that game. And if you're not familiar with Go, Go is like such a complex game that chess by comparison is for babies. On a Go board, there are more theoretical combinations than there are atoms in the known universe. So, and that tells you that this is not something that you can brute force compute against, because there is no computer big enough to actually figure that out. So they played in 2016, and AlphaGo beat Lee Sedol by 4-1. And now watch the dates. So that was 2016. 1 year later, DeepMind came back and says, "Hey guys, we have something new. You know, we basically looked at this and we now built AlphaGo. And we no longer won't bother playing a human because we know that we're beating them. So now we're playing the AI that had beaten that human." And the interesting thing is that AlphaGo 0 was only trained for 36 hours on the rules only. There was no human input. It had never played a game of Go. And that achieved a win rate against the original AlphaGo of 100-0. All this with a fraction of the training, a fraction of the computing power. And that is very, very important when you think about things like energy consumption, which is a bit the dark secret of AI, as well as, you know, the devices on which we could deploy this. And then, you know, in this splendid year last year, in September, this happened. The Guardian published an essay, and if you want to read along, feel free. And this essay was written by an AI, or by an ML algorithm named GPT-3. It was a generative pre-transformer model, and it was the third version of it. And as you can see, you know, what this thing does is effectively you tell it a topic, and it basically then predicts, in inverted commas, what would be a sensible next word in a line. But if you read through this text or Google it after this, you will see that this is actually a concise, well-written article that could actually have been written by a human. So all I want to tell you is that rapid progress in the space. I mentioned GPT-3, the essay, the Guardian essay writing thing. BERT and massive deep learning are some newer approaches as well that accelerate stuff that had taken us decades, and all of a sudden it's here and it's really, really quick. So I think this all comes because we're having more dimensions. You know, we have those more network nodes with more sensors, and they generate more raw data. And we now have advances in machine learning and artificial intelligence, which allow us to get to more structured data, and in a way to more sense about the world, and more sense about elements of the world. From a human perspective, that we are very, very good in doing specialist AI these days, and these are two of my favorite artists, so I don't think one's better than the other. But whereas Miles Davis was arguably the best ever on one single, I think played something like 23. And where specialist AI has become quite powerful in certain areas, generalist AI has not. And there are still many discussions out there how far away this is, or indeed if we will ever get there. What we will, however, need to get used to, because specialist AI becomes so good, is human-machine collaboration. And you know, this might look like this, where you have humans alongside actual robots. And these robots are being informed. They're a lot smarter than these big, unwieldy things that you have, where you needed to build a cage around it because they couldn't think or feel or sense anything. They could literally just repeat certain tasks. These things are better than that. But sometimes they might also look like this. This is a real life example of another of our portfolio companies called Sprout AI, and they effectively use AI to analyze claims documentation for insurers, and then filter this through into this dashboard to allow a human underwriter, as it was, to make better and faster decisions. So they bring down the time it takes to take a decision over an insurance claim from usually around about 2 weeks to now on average about 2 hours. And at the same time, they can reduce fraud by something like 98% or so, because pattern recognition of their machine learning models is so strong. And then, of course, the question is what comes beyond, right? And this can be scarier. In that movie, it could be really promising. But I think it's helpful to think about this and remember what is specifically human. In other words, there are things that where AI finds it pretty hard to enter, and there are some things like passion and things that are made with love. What you're looking at here is a pattern that my wife made for me. She's a tailor, to make me a suit. Now, a handmade suit is basically, has a lot of emotional value and is not just a garment that keeps you warm. And that emotional value, that's very hard to replace. Generally, empathy is something that AI finds difficult. If you've seen the movie Ex Machina, then you know that it can mimic it. But because it can't feel pain, it can't feel empathy. So if your work is in an area, like care, in hospitals and nurses, a lot of the teaching, then you're probably safe too. Creativity is something, genuine creativity is something AI finds hard. It is extremely good if you 200, 500 pictures from Van Gogh, then it is probably of making a picture like Van Gogh. It arguably would struggle quite a bit to, come up with what Jackson Pollock was or so. And then lastly, it's critical thought. It has to do with some of the system, the way our logic systems work, because we tend to work on inference. Inference looks back, so something for which there is no precedent, then inference struggle a bit harder to come up with new, original, critical thought. From a human and an educational perspective, the interesting thing is that those last four things that I just spoke about, none of this is on a curriculum of any school. And this is something I think that we might need to change in that. In passing, I think there's one thing I can promise you, that today is the slowest pace of progress that we will ever know. It will only accelerate from here. And let's make the best of it. Thank you very much. Thanks.
All right. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And you actually answered a question. I was going to ask you two quick questions, but your question about this should be in schools, I think that is absolutely, I think that's actually the correct approach. I know in the UK, there's I think there is this big push to teach computer science, if you will, at an early age, if you will, STEM across the board. So I really hope certainly that more and more countries sort of just start embracing this, because the more of us that know this, I just think that's better for humanity. But my other question is this, and you probably know this as well. In Estonia, the Estonia court system is using AI in a very limited way for small claims cases. And then in San Francisco, here in the United States, the court system is using AI to reduce racial bias, if you will, in different decisions. So what are your thoughts on at least how Estonia as a country and San Francisco as a city are using AI, and whether or not you think this is something that more countries and certainly more municipalities, whether big or small, should consider using, and the approach, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, so this basically goes back to human biases, because if we're training an AI on a biased data set, then it will be biased itself. Right. However, that is a solvable, arguably, it's an important and hard problem, but it is one that is arguably solvable. Now, right. It is important to remember that, if you read Daniel Kahneman, for instance, they did a study where they looked at how judges, human judges, are sentencing people. And it turns out that if they do this just before lunch, they hand out harder sentences. Because they're hungry.
Right.
You know? And the same is true later in the afternoons.
Right.
It is the same thing. So there are human biases, and if we get AI right, then of course, you know, because AI does need to have lunch, we could then arguably reduce that.
Right.
So there's one thing, and then the other important thing in this is that we need to build explainable AI. You know, so if we basically have a thing with a black box, and something comes out, and you know we have this famous thing says the computer says no, right?
Right.
And no one knows. And this is in things. I mean, this insurance claim startup I mentioned, they have to do the same thing, because if there is if someone files a claim against the insurer, and the insurance, let's say the insurance says no, we don't cover this.
Right.
And then they appeal, and they said, but why? So they need to be able to explain why they did that.
Right.
Now, that is something that there are many solutions that are being developed that effectively, you know, you have like a little cookie which you attach to whatever data set you do, and it traces it throughout its algorithm, and it kind of like leaves a little trail that allows you to see how it arrived at a certain decision, and that then makes it A, auditable, and B, also you could arguably check it and test it, which from a human rights perspective, or from a law perspective, is an important piece to look at.
Got it.
Sorry if that was a bit long-winded.
Oh no, I totally understand. But you do like it, or you sort of understand why why maybe a country or a city is doing it, or you just think maybe this is something that we should just kind of pay, you know, close attention to and allow it to just play itself out to see if it's congruent with the legal system.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's, you know, if you break it down, and specifically Estonia has a civil law system, so unlike the US and the UK, the civil law systems are a lot more codified. So in other words, you have, you know, the law all written down. It's pretty extensive, and particularly in Germany, where I came from, as you can imagine. So from an AI perspective, that means you have a lot of reliable source material on which you can train a model on.
Got it.
And so if you do that well enough, you know, and because law is effectively like a simple computational problem, if this, then that, right? If you breach this contract, then this is happening. So then you're liable for damages. Or if you steal a pack of cigarettes, then you're no longer allowed to come into my store. These are actually really relatively simple things. So the law is actually pretty capable of being aided, let's say, by algorithms, and it would make sure, you know, it would make it faster. It would make it cheaper. Access to law is a big issue in many countries. You know, if you can't afford a great lawyer, then you can have the greatest laws, but you could never afford to enforce them. And if that process is really super cheap, because the whole system has become largely automated, then that is a good thing, right? So as I said, this whole thing around biases and oversight or explainability, they are two very, very important and big issues. But if we can solve those, I think, you know, there's a lot of good that can come out of it.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, I'm fascinated by AI law and certainly loved your presentation, but I had to get that question in because I did see a slide of yours about AI law and how it's being used. So, hey, listen, thank you so much for, you know, being a part of this. And I guess we're going to go ahead on to our next speaker here. Thank you, Mr. Hirsch.